I'm very happy to be here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak here. I'm going to speak about Ipcc, taking the institutional perspective. What has this institution accomplished? What are the challenges, and how can it do even better in the future? I think it's fair to say the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has surpassed the expectations that its founders had for it, including Bert Bolin, the first chair of Ipcc. It was originally established with the objective of providing unbiased scientific advice to governments, particularly those negotiating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, with the anticipation that those negotiations would, as they did, go on for some period of time. In fact, of course, they're still going on today, with the latest manifestation being the run-up to the Copenhagen meeting in December. So we should look back at this point, which is now more than 20 years after the inception of Ipcc, to ask what will be these challenges, how can it do better in the future? So let's first look at where Ipcc has done a truly remarkable job. Well, in three ways. It's established to a surprising degree the consensus on climate change, which through its engagement of literally thousands of experts, particularly on the physical basis, the Working Group 1 activity, has really precluded attacks from the outside. It's been so inclusive and so comprehensive that it has been able to present a picture which not only has been accepted by governments, but which scientists themselves, who after all are specialists in very narrow disciplines, have learned to use as a basis for not only talking to the public about the issue, but for furthering their own research. It's sort of a guidance on what the key questions are for the future. Secondly, Ipcc has been remarkably effective in communicating this consensus to the policy elites and to the media, who, though despite the fact there's always kind of noise in the background, have been able to effectively incorporate and then propagate the meaning of the Ipcc message to the general public. And then finally, as I hinted in discussing the first point, Ipcc is so big and so effective at inclusion that it's effectively precluded competing assessments. Although assessments are done by governments or by the academies of science of individual governments, there's nothing that comes close to Ipcc in terms of comprehensiveness and credibility, partly because the process is so careful and has so many levels of review, and again includes many, many different experts from all the different relevant disciplines. So you could say, you could hold it up against the standard created by my friends in the social learning group at Harvard, led by Bill Clark, the criteria for a successful assessment being credibility, and it certainly has established a remarkable degree of credibility through the way it goes about assessing the knowledge. Salience, by its effect at communicating the consensus to the policy and the media elite. And legitimacy through its inclusiveness, giving the community the feeling that everybody has had a chance to have their say. It satisfies the criteria of a successful assessment, and there's been nothing like it. And this is incredibly important. I want to point to a poll taken in my own country, the United States, of the credibility of various, the trust that the public holds in various sectors of society, and scientists are at the top. People tend to trust everybody less now than they used to, but still, despite that erosion, scientists do very well with high credibility among 28% and somewhat trust, or I love that somewhat trust, among 54%, with a small percentage strongly distrusting, and the same 4% probably distrust their own mothers. So it's hard to tell what that means. But Ipcc, as remarkable a job as it's done, this should not keep us, and I have been an author, a lead author in Ipcc for several of the assessments, and hope to be involved in the future, yet it shouldn't keep us from examining the process closely and being critical where the need arises, and in fact where we can anticipate even more complex challenges in the future. So one key point is the public remains totally confused about climate change. The public doesn't understand the details. The public probably doesn't want to understand the details, and the public probably doesn't need to understand the details of anything, much less climate change, for there to be an effective, inclusive democratic process. The way democracy seems to work is that the public attains a general understanding of problems that most of the experts hold close, but that the public then relies on trusted intermediaries or surrogates who they feel can evaluate the problem. So, for instance, in the United States and more broadly, for certain sectors of the public, Al Gore served that function. But this is a problem ultimately. It's not clear how deeply this knowledge has to penetrate at what level for the public to become fully engaged in the business of implementing a solution to climate change. And until there is a solution to the problem, the very relevance to the Ipcc, along with everything else we're doing to solve the problem, has to be brought into question, or the efficacy, let's say. Secondly, because of the very nature of Ipcc and the dominance of Working Group 1 in the way Ipcc thinks about what it's doing, numerical models have become the key bearers of the message. So that if you can produce something out of a numerical model, like one of the big general circulation models, produce a result, it has an enhanced degree of credibility in the assessment compared to questions which cannot be numerically modeled, like the ice sheets, as we just saw. And then that raises a question, well, what do you do? The climate system is very complicated. What do you do with large parts of it being unmodelable at this time? And for some of them, particularly the societal interaction part, there is no prospect of quantitative modeling into the distant future. And maybe even worse, what do you do when you know there's a track record in the past of numerical models missing certain big phenomena, like the Antarctic ozone hole, for instance? How do you step outside the models and make assessments which are sensitive to the basic structural flaws in those models and to their ultimate limitations? This is a problem that scientists don't like to have to grapple with, but it's one that I think Ipcc, if it's going to argue that it has a full representation of not only what we know, but the uncertainty of what we know and what we fully don't know, really needs to come to grips with this more aggressively than it has in the past. And finally, and one of the reasons we haven't come to grips with the numerical modeling limitations in Ipcc is because there's very little inter-working group collaboration. As some of you may know, there are 3 working groups: the Physical Science Working Group, Working Group 1, the Working Group on Adaptation and Vulnerability, Impacts and Adaptation, which is Working Group 2, which starts to get into the issue of the more complex response of biological systems, including human beings, and the 3rd working group, the Working Group 3, which deals with policy and economic questions. Those working groups do not interact very well. They hardly interact at all, in fact, and the interaction is mostly at the very end in the development of the synthesis report. Unless that changes, we will never get a comprehensive view of uncertainty. We will never get outside the Working Group 1 dependence on models, and we'll never be able to get a meta view of what's really going on in the climate situation and how to adjust and adapt to it in the future. So, as a consequence of those limitations, most of the social sciences are ignored, which means that development-related questions are really understated in Ipcc, and the human factor in all of it is kind of marginalized. This doesn't mean that people in the Ipcc aren't aware of it, and there isn't a great struggle to try to incorporate adaptation, vulnerability, and development. It just means Ipcc has a long way to go in doing so. Number 2, uncertainty is not treated coherently in Ipcc. There's been a valiant attempt, stimulated originally by Steve Schneider, among others, to get a uniform treatment of uncertainty across the working groups. But even within Working Group 1, there isn't a completely coherent assessment of uncertainty, and as a result, it's impossible for the other working groups, the ones that deal with policy, to really provide a risk management framework, because there's no way to really evaluate the risks intelligently because the uncertainties aren't treated consistently. This has been a particular problem, again, in the ice sheet example in Working Group 1, in Ipcc. Essentially, when it got to the point of trying to deal with the model failure that was just described by Johan, IPCC Working Group 1 threw up its hands because it didn't know what to do beyond report numbers from models. I'm simplifying that a little bit. It's a more complicated story. And the net effect of all of this is that Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the famous injunction to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, remains and will remain for the future largely undefined, because defining it really means understanding uncertainty and providing a coherent and integrated vision of risk management and the human ability to adapt. And IPCC just can't do that at this point, so the governments don't have the full guidance that they need. So, but beyond that, there's an even more additional layer of criticism, which is, are we really trying to bite off more than we can chew with IPCC? Is there too much work happening at this point for too little gain? Thousands of scientists are involved, and that means that instead of doing basic research, they're doing assessment-driven work. And that's fine up to a point. We want them doing that. I sacrifice some of my basic research time during IPCC's writing process so I can do assessment. That's basic research that doesn't get done because there's limited human resources. And it's very expensive in time. People don't get paid for it, so it is an effective cost to them personally. And as I said, the deflection of scientific activity. And you can, this comes down, I want to quote this part of the IPCC Working Group 1 summary for policymakers, because I think it makes the point for me. This statement, the IPCC Working Group 1 and the rest of us in IPCC 2 are very proud of this statement. Susan Solomon, the leader of Working Group 1, has made up little buttons which have the word warming is unequivocal on them. It's the statement that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations and so forth. Well, it's the word unequivocal, and the shock value of seeing scientists use a word like unequivocal for a complex system, which had a tremendous reverberation in the press. But on the other hand, if you think about it, the IPCC could have made, this is when the AR4, the fourth assessment, came out, this statement could have been made with a slightly weaker word 15 years ago. And one could ask, if all that's really happening, now this is simplifying, but if a key point of the fourth assessment was to highlight this, that's a hell of a lot of work, 3 years of work by thousands of people to squeeze out what's really a marginal progress to make the media happy, basically. And if, on the other hand, you take the view, well, unequivocal is really supposed to cast a kind of stellar dust over the rest of IPCC's findings, which are far from unequivocal, and I think maybe there is a little bit of thinking that way. Well, that's kind of unfair. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be hiding the uncertainties, even in the presentations to the press. So I think this statement, and I have and wear one of those buttons. I think it's a great thing that was done. Still has the tension in it over IPCC's limited ability to make rapid progress on the problem. It's a big, complex problem, and that challenge, I think, will only grow in the future. So I think, actually, we're trying to do too much by doing these mega assessments every 6 years, and that instead IPCC should be focused on a limited number of problems, like the ice sheets, where there are rapid developments, where the uncertainties are big, but there's promise for making big leaps in understanding, and having the repeated diagrams which show radiative forcing or repeated statements about how certain it is that Earth is warming, or whether it's 95% or 98% sure that humans had a part in the warming. I don't think we have to repeat that in the same way every 6 years. I think we could have a spacing of 10 or 15 years between major assessments. And again, I won't go over this, but I was going to make some points about the ice sheets, but Stefan has already done such a good job about it. IPCC published numbers and then effectively put a statement at the top saying these numbers are worthless, and by saying that the models of ice sheets are ineffective, so we can't really say much about the ice sheet component, which is basically not included in these values, which gave the upper limit of about 0.6 meters in the next century. There are now, as Stefan just said, different views on how large the upper limit really is, and there are different estimates ranging from somewhat above IPCC's number, the 0.85 that Stefan gave, to running up to about 2 meters. One could do a better job on this right now, and I think that what we're closing in on is that it's very unlikely we get multi-meter, 3, 4, 5, 6 meters sea level rise, as some had asserted during this century, but it's also likely that the IPCC upper limit is too low. And you had a different figure, but I'll show this one from further down the coast, which Stefan actually showed was not New York City, but was the the Jersey City coastline right opposite Manhattan. And we're just down the coastline is Atlantic City, and there's a slightly different aerial view. And you see this just immense multi-billion-dollar infrastructure hard up against the coast, and it's idiotic. And there's nothing been done in coastal planning in the United States and probably most other countries, which tries to accommodate the fact that this is not a sensible thing to do, given that sea level is rising and to some extent accelerating. And as the deltaic area, as Stefan pointed out, are very important, where we have hundreds of millions of people, this is Bangladesh, packed into an area which is relatively small, and with big chunks of land, which in the foreseeable future will simply be underwater. What's the human response to that? How do we adapt? How do we even start to think about adapting to that kind of problem? So, and this ice sheet problem is not new. If you go back in the whole history of IPCC, you see, starting with the first assessment, then the second assessment, and then the third assessment, the assessors basically said, we don't know what's going on with the models, but it's all we have. And the models say sea level is not likely to rise fast, so what else can we say? This has been around for 20 years. There must be other options for assessing a problem when you can't put numerical results so easily on it. And again, some of the points that Stefan made about the recent literature, here's the Ipcc range. Stefan Rahmsdorf produced a slightly different range here. There's a Dutch estimate, which uses an approach, by the way, which is very similar to yours, of looking at key ice sheet basins. I was part of this. It was really an international effort, which isn't published yet, which is going to produce a somewhat higher range for 2200, and then there's a German commission estimate for 2300. But none of these estimates are numerically useful at this point, but what they do show is the upper limit on the loss rate for ice sheets is probably considerably higher than IPCC said, and in the future, the risk that the upper limit will rise even faster is, well, that's the wrong way to say that. The best guesses about what the upper limit on sea level rise are quite a bit higher than the 1 meter in this century. That is, the risk rises relatively rapidly, at least according to the thinking of several different reports in the literature. There are other problem areas. I don't want to focus too much on ice sheets. The carbon cycle basically determines the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the amount of radiative forcing is very uncertain. There are feedbacks that have been identified, both positive and negative, and one must conclude that IPCC has a lot more work to be done on what the carbon cycle feedback will be in the future and how much it could add to carbon dioxide amounts in the atmosphere. Ocean circulation has been an issue which has been pointed to by IPCC as a possible key question for the future. There's been the long-term question about the collapse of the meridional overturning circulation in the Atlantic. The IPCC in recent assessment sort of put it on the back burner. It's probably not that immediate a problem, but I think it will return. I don't have a personal view on how important it is. I do know that the assessment of it is rather incomplete at this point. And then moving on to other issues, the cost of emissions reductions, the numbers in the IPCC report, which do reflect the literature, are really incomplete. There is not a good model or picture for how the beginning of responses to the need to reduce emissions will either raise or lower costs of the emissions reductions, which come in second stages. Those implicit, for instance, the rate of implicit technological change that occurs in response to policies is really unknown. That's an area which is key for policymakers and which IPCC is really not addressed. Then finally, the full body of the question of factors affecting the resilience and the efficacy of solutions and the ability to adapt, folding in the human psychological response to risk, how humans will perceive the risk, how humans will perceive the policies which are made by governments and respond to the policies. That whole area is just off the table. There's nobody in IPCC. There is no lead author, really, that's competent to deal with it. IPCC doesn't know how to incorporate qualitative approaches, and it will need to learn how to do so. For instance, questions like how particular technologies, in this case solar photovoltaics, are adopted under different circumstances, central, decentralized but feeding into the grid, or totally off the grid. When do people choose what to use and under what circumstances? Or a question that was touched upon in IPCC, the different phases of nuclear power, the 3 Mile Island from 20 some odd years ago, the somewhat better run French nuclear program, and the threat to the future from diversion of bomb-grade material. How do you get an integrated sense of how policymakers are supposed to think about that in the global warming context? You do find about 3 or 4 paragraphs in IPCC about it, but it's a key problem, and we don't really address it fully. So what are the options for addressing the full range of uncertainty? First of all, IPCC has to get better at complementing numerical models with paleoclimate information. This is a process which actually was started by Working Group 1 in this assessment, but has to get more comprehensive, and looking at the piling up of the increasing number of observations of the climate system to create a coherent picture which can help circumvent the structural uncertainties, the sort of inherent biases that are common to the models in many cases. Qualitative methods have to be introduced. And most important, I think we need a full airing of the disagreements. IPCC was so obsessed in its first 20 years with knocking down the contrarians, providing the governments with the notion that there was a basic picture, that it's been afraid to go to the public and say, and look, there are disagreements. Authors don't always agree on all these points. So instead of trying to force a consensus across the board, I think IPCC should have more transparency, let a little air in the room, and essentially give publics, and more important, the governments, a view of the full range of disagreements among experts about important questions like the ice sheets, because it's a bit of an embarrassment to IPCC to go through a 7-year assessment, to engage thousands of people, and immediately have articles coming out in the literature, as has happened on ice sheets, which basically say, well, what IPCC did in this case was not of great value. And finally, that can be accomplished, I think, more easily if from time 0, which means starting when the assessment starts, which means now for the next assessment, working group activities are more fully implemented. So I recommend full assessments less often, more special reports targeted at fewer problems, with much quicker turnover time, focus on key developments in the literature, which are of a direct and immediate interest to policymakers, and a greater transparency for the process as a whole. And finally, IPCC was and is a unique and brilliant invention. From an international institutional point of view, you couldn't have done any better. If one had started thinking about getting IPCC, if we had thought too hard about how to get IPCC to be able to do what it's been able to do today, we would have screwed it up by sort of ad-libbing the whole situation and not really planning too much in the future. I think we did a terrific job. So, but like any other institution, it could be improved. And my greatest fear is that IPCC will, in fact, now do what all other big, successful institutions do, which is sit on its laurels, not learn, not improve, and not adapt to the future. And the thing about the climate problem is it doesn't sit still. It moves very fast. And if IPCC sits on its laurels, it's going to be out of date, and 10 years from now, it'll probably be irrelevant. Thank you.